the Wailing Wall and Temple area. It began to rain. The first shower there had been in Jerusalem for months. The water poured down the central way of the street in a brown torrent, carrying with it pieces of dirty paper and cabbage stalks and other refuse. I had left my umbrella to be repaired by a street jobber at the Jaffa Gate, and so we took shelter in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. By lighting matches, we found our way into the crypt, which is supposed to contain the burial place of Joseph of Arimathea. We saw 2 graves cut out of the native sandstone. They were not deep, no deeper than when I stood up in them than my groin, but they were obviously very old and had never been tampered with. We emerged from the cavernous place and were once more within the rotunda of the Holy Sepulchre. The tomb of Jesus is indeed lacking in dignity. If he had in truth risen from the dead, here, what a commentary upon the taste of the human race to mark the spot thus with so singular an event had taken place. Anyone passing the grave who knew nothing of Christianity would suspect that something was wrong. It is the kind of thing that Herodotus might have seen in an Egyptian temple. We stepped for a moment into the Orthodox Greek chapel. Men like white-bearded mandrills in an ornamented cave chanted here hour after hour. Was there ever so gross a superstition? When we reached the Jaffa Gate, I found that my umbrella had been mended. I had 2 of my possessions repaired in Jerusalem, this umbrella and my spectacles. The latter I had fitted with a new horn rim for the right eye, differing in colour from the one that held the left lens in place. This pleased me. Whenever I put on my spectacles to write the cradle of God, I would imagine that I derived advantage from it. It seemed that it might serve me well for peering into these abstruse matters. The umbrella did not last long, and the manner of its mending was looked upon with great contempt when I took it eventually to Barney Hallett, the scissors grinder in Dorchester. In the afternoon we again wandered through the city, eventually going out through the gate of Damascus and walking round the northeast corner of the wall of the city. On the eastern side of Jerusalem is a Muslim graveyard, very dusty and with an occasional tree. Across the valley was the Mount of Olives, and lower down on the further ridge of the valley was Jehoshaphat, where endless Jewish gravestones. He that is buried in Palestine, it is as though he was buried under the altar. I wished to go again to the Wailing Wall, so into the city we turned by St. Stephen's Gate. We found a great number of Jews collected there. We could hear their outcries from the distance. Many of them wore velvet coats of blue and orange with fur round their velvet caps. Their curled locks touched their white cheeks as they swayed their long bodies backward and forward, kissing the stones of the dead wall. And it was curious to see them, and the sound of them through the twilight streets made me think of the turbulence of gulls under a sea cliff. I noticed that the Pleiades were over Mount Scopus. Joseph Caiaphas, looking back for a moment, must often have seen them as he was returning to the Hill of Evil Counsel after transacting his day's business. The following morning we set out for the Dome of the Rock. We were foolish enough to accept the services of a shifty, shabby, blinking Armenian guide. This man was a torment to us, and our minds did not become receptive or tranquil until we had bribed him to leave us. Ignorance is always better than knowledge with folly. The sun was pouring down upon us. The wide open spaces of the ancient temple area were as fresh and bright as Trinity Great Court. We walked about with speechless delight, now marvelling at the delicate colouring of the dome, now observing with appreciation the graceful proportions of the outer buildings, now kneeling to touch the petals of a tiny hawkweed pressing itself up between flagstones which even yet retained the marks of Roman chisels upon them. The whole enclosure had about it a noble simplicity. I was happy. I would have been content to spend my life meditating here on these sunlit platforms. In front of the Mosque of Aqsa, I saw a Muslim praying. It was a beautiful sight. He was on his knees, his forehead touching the ground, his human spine bent like a decrescent moon. Here was the expression of religious emotion in its most elementary form. Savages worship the sun so. It is the prerogative of man, the first gesture of consciousness. Who has ever seen a hind on its knees under a wild fig tree, or an urchin in its piety? I examined the great sacrificial rock under the dome, the rock to which the angels came on pilgrimage before Adam. It was possible still to see the channels down which the blood of the sacrificed animals used to flow in the time of King Solomon. I liked the blue-green colour of the mosque's mosaics, and as I was putting on my shoes again outside, I observed with a thrill of appreciation the clean, sharp shadows that the cypress trees cast upon the stones. The whole of the area was not flagged, however, for wandering in the direction where the Antonia had once stood. I found the native rock emerging out of the dust and gravel. I stooped to touch it. There it was under my hand as David had seen it, as King Solomon had seen it, as Jesus perhaps had seen it, outcropping in some unconsidered corner where no white stone had as yet been laid. How strange it would be if everyone living on earth today could suddenly rid his mind of its local religious preconceptions. With unreasoning passion we preserve our piles on sacred hills, yet actually I suppose these acres that set our imaginations trembling are the same as any other. It is thinking that makes the difference. Under the shadow of eternity, this celebrated temple area is in no way to be preferred to East Cheldon Green, mud and stones and grass and hawkweed. The half-naked water carriers were filling their goatskins at the fountain, swearing and quarrelling among themselves and then going off with their swollen bags over their shoulders. Life, daily life, vigorous and unredeemed, continues here, as elsewhere, unretarded, unmodified by any circumstance of human fancy. We look at the dome of the rock and deplore the fact that this parcel of ground should have fallen into the hands of these fanatics. The Muslims look at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and by a play upon words call it the Church of the Dunghill. Where is reason to be found, that detached, dispassionate sense of the poetry of things? The early Christians used to make a point, so it is reported, of abusing the site of the Jews' temple. When they felt the stir of their natural occasions come upon them, they would hurry out of the way to gratify their spite by defiling the historic precincts. I do not mean to suggest that the 12 were guilty of such malice. 'Tis to a period after the destruction of the temple by Titus that I refer. We spent a long time before the Golden Gate. It had a noble antique look, though I was told afterward that none of its huge stones are Herodian. It is upon the vines of Judah, carved over the capitals of the Hulda Gate below the Mosque of Aqsa, that the eyes of Jesus must surely have rested, those seer's eyes that could be so penetrating and so powerful. Perhaps he looked at them unconsciously, raising his head a little as he was going up to cleanse the temple courts, his rope ends in his hand. We climbed onto the walls to the right of the Golden Gate and walked along them to the entrance of King Solomon's stables. We could see below the tomb of Absalom. It remained unaltered. It appeared to us as it must have appeared to Jesus when, looking at it from the white corridors of King Solomon's porch, it had put into his mind his famous thrust. We now went down a stairway. I never saw such enormous underground vaults. The Crusaders had used them for their horses, and it was possible even yet to see the holes drilled through the stone for the tethering of their beasts.